Are you into polo, nuclear weapons, and gangsters? Well, let me explain why that is maybe not enough. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to me talking about books, and today we'll be talking about Polostan by Neal Stephenson, the first part of the Bomb Light series. I don't know how many volumes it will have. Audible claims it's a trilogy. I assume it might be more according to what Stephenson wrote on his Substack, but this is the first one. It came out for Europeans like 2 weeks ago. I guess it came out for the rest of the world today. I read it, I had fun with it, and now I'm going to talk about why I think there's issues and all the other stuff. So we'll do the usual thing. I'll give you a quick synopsis of, what it is, why you should maybe read it, or what kind of things you should like if you want to read this, and then we'll talk a bit about, the context, doing some slight analysis, and maybe have a broader point on the issues that arise with historical fiction on the one hand and writing, series on the other hand, and then we'll kind of hopefully wrap this all up. Are you ready? Well, I guess then, grab your polo pony and get started, right? All right. So, Polostan is a story set broadly between the early 1920s and the mid-1930s in both Russia and the US. It deals with sort of the preliminaries that will at some point lead to the development of at least one nuclear weapon, probably both sides of the, the Soviet and the American, possibly even the British side. I don't know yet because of one big part of this. This book follows one specific character, and Neal Stephenson has said that each volume of this series will follow a specific other character, so I have no idea where this will be going. But since Aurora, our focus character in this one, is both sometimes in the US and sometimes in the Soviet Union, I can promise you those two. So that's the first part that you need to understand. It's a historical fiction. I think that Neal Stephenson is technically better at writing historical fiction than he is when he writes pure science fiction, for the simple reason that there is some level of restraint or sort of like, he's kind of forced to adhere to historical facts, and I think that does sometimes rein his wilder fancies in. I very much really appreciate the Baroque Cycle a lot, and I really appreciate Cryptonomicon a lot. So yeah, I was really excited about this one. I read it. I had a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. If you are interested in that specific era, if you like Neal Stephenson's general way of writing stories, that, the focus on somewhat oddball, quirky characters, weird sort of like bits and pieces he's picked up over stuff, and if you're interested in the the development of nuclear physics and the development of the first atomic bomb in during the 1930s, yeah, why not give this a read? Maybe if you feel like it, just buy it and leave it lying around until at least volume 2 comes out, possibly next year, possibly the year after, who knows. But that may make reading a bit easier because, as I said, this is the first part of a series, and it does very much leave a lot of stuff open at the end. So there is very clearly a very open end. So this can, is probably not as satisfying as like a standalone novel. Be aware of all of that. But if you enjoy Stephenson, if you enjoyed Cryptonomicon, or in particular the World War II or 1930s plot lines in Cryptonomicon, yeah, you will probably very much enjoy this. Also, ideally, get yourself a bunch of books about that era, like history books about that era, because context will be one of the things that we need to talk about now that you have gone and read the book or decided that you don't care about spoilers, and follow me after I have a bit of a beer when we talk about analysis, and there will be spoilers from here out. So yeah, go get the book, read it. It's short. It's surprisingly short for a Neal Stephenson novel, so I'll give him that. Yeah, get it, read it, or don't read it. From here on out, be forewarned, there will be spoilers. All right, you're still here, so I guess let's do the analysis part. So this will be sort of like going through like several points. I'll start talking about the idiosyncrasies of the Neal Stephenson writing style, because I think it's a huge part of, why these books work so well for me, why they may not necessarily work for others. But they also lead to one specific aspect that will come back later on that may be somewhat troubling to some people. So there's that. That's the first part. Then we'll talk a bit about historical fiction, historiography, that kind of stuff, with some specific details of like where I think this book, as a standing, as a first part of a series, lacks context and does lead to some sort of like problematic aspects of this, which obviously also ties back to the whole idea of this being a series. And after all of that, we'll kind of tie this all up, I guess. So let's start and talk about Neal Stephenson's very specific approach to writing stories or general style. And I think this is both a strength and a weakness, depending on where you fall on these things. See, Neal Stephenson's strength for me, or one of the things that has always made his books the books they are, is he has a great talent to find things that he gets really interested in and then dig deep. And those are always usually two things. The first part is technology, one specific sort of like technological change, one specific technological development, scientific development, should probably say, not just technology, like scientific development. That's something he always gets very interested in, reads up a lot on it, and then explains it in excruciating detail to the reader. But, and this is like where his strength comes in, Neal Stephenson is a great explainer. Like the parts of nuclear physics in this one, the parts even about like something as boring as economics in the Baroque Cycle, they are always really interesting to read because Stephenson is just that good at explaining this stuff. The same for like, say, coding in Snow Crash, or the philosophy bits and pieces in Anatheme, or any of the other stuff that he does. He's very good at explaining science in a way that is much more entertaining than the way we usually got in scientific bits and pieces explained in old, like 1950s, 1960s science fiction. So that's sort of like the scientific and science fiction part of his writing is always very entertaining because he's good at explaining shit. I can just listen to Neal Stephenson explaining all kinds of technology to me all day because he's good at it. And that's the first part. The other big part of, the Neal Stephenson way of writing books is oddities. Neal Stephenson has always been very interested in odd stuff, and that usually comes through. That's both odd aspects of just history, and obviously that also kind of falls through when it comes to his like typical characters, which are also usually oddballs in one way, shape, or form. And that's the next big part. It can be all kinds of weird stuff that he picks. In this case, you can clearly see that at some point Neal Stephenson learned about the fact that a lot of like polo horses or ponies were for some reason or other bred in the United States in the 1930s and then sold to rich British kids who really play polo because, who else does? So, and that is a really weird thing. And I didn't know about it. I can totally see why he got like really excited about it and had to write a book about it. I get it. And we always have something of that sort in each of his books. There's usually at least one of these like weird things that kind of come up and interest him. And then the formula for a Neal Stephenson novel is usually finding a really odd bit of history or a society or whatever, and combining it with whatever technological progress or scientific concept he's currently in love with, and tying those together, and then finding at least one character that's a bit of like a drift kind of person, and usually has a weird family background. In this case, this is of course Aurora, who grew up partly in the beginning of the Soviet Union, right after the revolution and civil war in the 1920s. Then moved to the US because her mother is American, her father at least has American citizenship, and her parents' family are sort of anarcho-capitalist cowboy gangsters somewhere in the wild breeding polo ponies. So that's sort of like the typical Neal Stephenson character. You find one of those every book, and I'm fine with that. It's cool. It's really entertaining, and it feeds that sort of like romantic pulp aspect of the storytelling a lot, to have these kind of characters that are not, your average character. Because this is a very unrealistic character. Those kind of characters maybe exist. Yeah, there's very little chance for them to exist, but there's enough of a chance because of the historical research that Stevenson usually does to make it kind of work out. So that's sort of the first part that I wanted to look at. That is obviously packed into Neal Stephenson's very specific way of writing stories, of telling stories. And there's two aspects to this. The first part is his way of writing, his language, his prose style, which is very fast-paced and usually has a good dose of irony, or at least some level of ironic distance to like the things happening in the world. Like, you're tightly focused on the character, on that one main, focus character, whatever that may be, depending on the book. In this case, obviously, it's Aurora. But the way things are described within that always have this sort of like cool, ironic layer to it. The kind of thing that you find in something like Snow Crash, but you also find sort of in the tone that stuff like Buffy the Vampire Slayer in the late 90s in television had, that like sort of like always slightly zingy, whatever tone to it. That's something that also is always in Stephenson's writing in a lot of ways. And sometimes that obviously breaks out into very weird, odd paragraphs about something completely out of the way, in the same way that you would find, weird excursions in something like a Thomas Pynchon novel. There's certainly a layer to that, of that sort of aspect of American postmodernist, right, postmodern fiction in there as well. For instance, Snow Crash, that's the long bit about toilet paper. In Cryptonomicon, it's the whole excursion about the sex thing, where they test the machine to sort of record conversations on the other side of the wall thing. You always have one of those bits in there as well. And that's basically what makes a Neal Stephenson novel. And if you like them, yeah, they're mostly all interesting, with possibly, some of them kind of working better for you depending on your personal interests than some others, but that's basically the formula. And Polostan is exactly that. It does all of that in a very, very tight way. As I said, it's a short novel. It does all of that really well. And it's fun to follow Aurora, both through like the Soviet Union and through the World's Fair and all the other stuff happening in the US. Before that, that's fun. The structure is fairly clever. Obviously, Stephenson has always, played with jumps in time. This time around, the structure being mostly about Aurora being interviewed and then tortured by certain Soviet investigators while working in the Soviet Union, and then the stuff happening before that, basically the flashbacks being framed as her, explanations to her different torturers and so forth. That is, I guess, a really nice way of, not nice way, but like a clever way of doing that specific time jump structure, compared to just having time jumps, oftentimes as you see it in, earlier stuff like Snow Crash, where there's not necessarily always a good jumping off point for the next flashback. This time around, the structure, I think, works really well and drives home certain points about, the Soviet Union, or in like the 1930s, which is, let's say, not the least paranoid time in history ever. So that's the structure here. Now let's talk about difficulties that I feel come up with this approach. And there's several difficulties here. The first part is, and Stephenson acknowledges this, of course, that by focusing each volume of the series on one specific character, there's always a lot of context missing. Like, we only have one specific person's way through life described in this specific story, and by being focused on her very closely, that also means that she doesn't necessarily know everything. The parts that are basically her childhood experiences will obviously are told from like the perspective of a child, more or less, which obviously makes talking about the different purges done by the Cheka in the early 1920s somewhat context-free compared to a more omniscient narrator. That's the first part. Like, this is very tightly focused and leaves a lot out. Now, this is obviously normal, and if you read like a first-person narrative, like something like Gene Wolfe would write, that's even more so if you go, down that road. That's just an authorial choice. The second part is that this is a historical novel. This is historical fiction. Now, the thing with history is that you can never actually explain history. Like, if history is just everything that happened until right now, no matter how you put together history, how you present history, you will always have to make choices. Every historian, every historiographer picks and chooses and leaves out a lot of details and context. Every single historical history book you read leaves out a lot of context. Every historical fiction does even more of that because, you have a story to tell and you can't, step back and give a lot of context and so forth. Now, that is obviously something that has always happened with every single historical fiction novel. When you go to something like the Baroque Cycle, and I think it's a good, important, good way of doing this here, The context is also very focused on the different characters. Like if we're out there with Jack Shafto, you get like a very different perspective on Europe than you get when you're out with Daniel Waterhouse or when you're out with Eliza. The difference is that because of the more Baroque storytelling style that Stephenson chose there, he has a lot more, liberty to drop in further explanations and context for the world, because that's just the way that, like, historically Baroque stories were told. The same thing if you go and read, say, Ada Palmer's novels, Terra Ignota. Because of, like, the more meandering Baroque storytelling style, you can drop in a lot of that stuff. Polostan is not that storytelling style. It's a much tighter storytelling style, so Stephenson leaves out a lot of context. And the problem with like leaving out context from history is that it's easy to sort of like miss points or misconstrue points in a lot of ways. Now, obviously, I am not expecting Neal Stephenson to write apologia for the Soviet Union. I would not do that either, because the Soviet Union, in a lot of ways, especially under Stalin, sucked. Surprising to hear that from me, right? But I'm not doing apologia for it. The problem is, though, that the way these things come together will lead to some issues that we need to talk about now. Not only about the Soviet Union, but also about America. See, there's a couple of key sort of events that are described in this novel. I'm going to go and look at most of these like individually and explain why this may be a problem. And we'll start in the US, because the purges in the 1920s, they're terrible. Stalin, well, in this case, it's still under Lenin, but the Bolsheviks did a lot of purges, and they were usually terrible. Obviously, there is context to be had about the Soviet Union and, the whole, like, Russian Revolution and the situation that was before and the situation that came after. There's a lot of stuff that can explain how these things happen, but they will never apologize. They explain, but they are not an apology. Apology is the wrong word here, but you know what I mean. The next part, however, is the US part. Because, see, a large part of the US story takes place, interestingly enough, during the Bonus Army and Bonus March. And I think that one is probably the first time where I felt that this book is falling short because it's lacking context. Because I don't know how many of you, dear watchers and possible readers of the Polostan, know about the Bonus March, the Bonus Army, and what's the context for that. And it is, in fact, was a big event of a lot of World War I veterans coming to protest in Washington in the 1930s during the Great Depression, shortly before FDR got elected, because their promised bonuses for like pension and so forth were not paid out because everyone is, it's a depression. And it's a large protest that was very violently suppressed by the government at the time. It was one of the key situations that turned one Smedley Butler into a less active supporter of U.S. imperialism, to put it mildly. But it's a lot of context that is missing, because all we hear here is that like all the communists are gathering in Washington. But it's not all the communists. It's just like a lot of like highly frustrated, poor, starving people that, well, during World War I did in fact fight for their country and now are asking to get the thing that the government promised them. So there's a context here that is completely missing out of this. And because, the way especially US narratives run in history, it's not necessarily something that, unless you have read something like, I don't know, Howard Zinn or People's History of the Americas, you probably don't necessarily know about that, right? And it's left out of here. It's more like, why are all the communists coming to Washington in the 1930s? We don't even hear what the bonuses is. They're just called the Bonus Army, and it's left to you to look that up. Will you do that? I sure hope so. I can't promise it, and I think that's one of those first aspects where the tight focus on one 17 or 16-year-old girl being there with her communist agitator father leaves out a lot of stuff that might be valuable to know, and that in, say, a version like that was written in the style of the Baroque Cycle, Stephenson would have had like a couple of pages to explain the larger background, because that's a different way of telling that story. Here it's missing, and I think that's a problem, because it does impact a lot of like stuff that is still very, very much relevant to American and world history nowadays, and that's sort of like where I think the second layer of danger lies. There is, of course, more. Let's talk about the Soviet Union for a second. See, The opening scenes of this story are, of course, in Magnitogorsk, where a huge steel production complex is built. Well, not the opening scenes. The opening scene is a prologue, but like the first chapter. And there's a lot of stuff about like how everyone is freezing, dying, how a lot of people are dying. It's all terrible. It's and this is, I think, where a lot of the sort of like strengths or weaknesses, or at least idiosyncrasies of Stevenson's writing kind of don't work out as well as they usually do. Because there is a layer of humor to, you know, all the paranoia, poverty, all the problems of the Soviet Union. There's a way of making that, turning that into humor in an ironic way. But it does only work if you have a lot of context. The problem is, like, an example for this would be, for example, The Master and Margarita by Bulgakov. That is an incredibly funny book, but it was written during that time, so Bulgakov assumed that everyone reading his book would completely get the context. The problem is nowadays, the context is a very different one, where we just all assume that, you know, after the end of history and the failing of the Soviet Union, that, you know, all forms of communism, all forms of the Soviet Union were a big failure. Everyone died because everyone was poor, because communism is bad. This kind of leaves out the whole fact that, like, once the Soviet Union actually took over from the Tsar, the country was basically still in the Middle Ages, to put it bluntly. And modernizing a country in 20 years will absolutely go wrong. Now, once again, I'm not doing apologia for the Soviet Union here. A lot of stuff was wrongly decided, but understanding that this poverty comes not necessarily just from mismanagement, but from, like, having the worst starting point ever in history, I guess, in that regard, I feel is important. And it kind of fails. So having all these sort of, like, ironic takes on, like, people dying and people starving because everything sucks feels a bit shallow as a dig against the Soviet Union in that regard, because, yeah, what else should they do? And this obviously leads to the two other big pieces here that I think are kind of connected, and that is the character of Lavrenti Beria, and then, of course, the quick look at the Holodomor. Before we move into that, yes, the Holodomor was a genocide. It's absolutely horrible. I'm not going to say anything positive about it. The problem is, once again, however, that having context around that is kind of important, but all we get is like two scenes of people starving in Ukraine. And I'm sure that will play well right now, because we have basically Russia genociding Ukraine, which is certainly something that the contemporary zeitgeist in the West will very much appreciate. So there's that. But explaining why, how, and so forth we came here is another thing. And here's, once again, where the sort of like ironic distance, it's not as ironic here than it is in other ways, but like the somewhat flippant tone that Stevenson usually has, once again feels like shallow, or not doing the whole thing justice, the whole tragedy justice enough, I feel. And once again, this is very much because, you know, you're so focused on one character, and of course having that specific prose style. And now we need to talk about Beria for a second. Now, Lavrenti Beria is probably maybe the second biggest monster under Stalin, in Stalin's Russia. Definitely high up there. He's also like a very troubling person. We meet him here as obviously someone who tries to get Aurora into the Secret Service and do spy stuff and so forth, which is kind of what his job was, because he worked for the NKVD and all kinds of other different versions of that same sort of like secret police. And the problem is, the way he gets introduced is while Aurora gets tortured, and he's jerking off to it. And like, yeah, right? Is this the situation where you need to actually have that one sort of like sexual scene in there that is kind of necessary for every Neal Stephenson novel? Because while there is a lot of stuff about Beria being a rapist and all kinds of other stuff, I feel it lacks context once again, and it's obviously we can't expect everyone to have read like at least one biography of Lavrenti Beria. That's very hard to do, but it kind of reduces someone with a lot of complexity into basically a sexual pervert who has a lot of power, which flattens history, or the rather complex system of, you know, Stalinist power structures and so forth, into like a weird sort of like travesty. Now, if you want to tell that kind of travesty story, you can just, you can do that. But that's not necessarily what Stephenson is trying to do here, I think. It just feels that, like, his tendency to be flippant, his tendency to sort of, like, narrow things down to, like, a very minute point, which can be hilarious in other situations, is kind of overtaken by the gravity of the subject matter in a lot of ways. And does, in fact, come across as, well, not shallow in this case, but, like, actually callow. And that, I felt that's sort of like a failure of where like subject matter, form, and style kind of collide, because the subject matter is a very serious and dark one with a lot of complexity, nuance that is very much still informing how we today think about this era. And, looking at the way that calling someone a communist or a Marxist or whatever is still, like, very much something that is used in actual political discourse right now, does have, like, another weight than you writing a story about, say, 17th century deism, right? That has a different weight. And that sort of, like, responsibility kind of falls to the wayside. On the other hand, the very ironic, smart people cleverness, hey, did you get all my allusions and stuff, writing style of the postmoderns, in the same way that you have it with, like, say, someone like Umberto Eco, is not necessarily suitable for this kind of stuff. We can see that with Umberto Eco, who got, like, a lot of trouble when he was writing stuff like the Prague Cemetery, which, does do a similar thing about anti-Semitism in a lot of ways. And there's a lot, yeah, it's a there's a lot of, like, high risk of failure there, and I think this book does, in that regard, kind of fail, which is finally where the form comes in, because by having only one narrative of one specific character told in this book, a lot of this context that might be, told through the perspectives of other characters, and I assume, for now, that this will happen, is missing for the reader, which, yeah, I get it. I don't know how to do that. I'm not the expert on. I'm not Neal Stephenson's editor. I'm not Neal Stephenson. I don't know how to do this. But I'm saying, like, taking this specific choice can be rather dangerous with a book with this sort of, like, serious subject matter. In this specific case, where maybe making a different choice would help readers to understand stuff in a better way. Where we live in times where the subject matter is still highly polarized, and I think that's where Polostan, for me, does, I don't want to say fail, because I haven't read the rest of the stories, but where I think, as the start for a new series with, all the other books somewhere coming in the future, is a bit of a stutter start, and certainly one that can go horribly wrong in the future. Well, that's all I have to say about Polostan right now. As I said, hard to judge this until the rest is out, but it showcases, like, the responsibilities that come with historical fiction in general, where we can't assume that our readers know the context, where there's always more context to be known, and where the tone we choose and the form we choose to tell the things that we want to tell can very much go wrong in a way that telling a pure fantasy story can never fail. Or, yeah, that's basically the interesting thing for me about Polostan, beyond, me having a good time, because I already know about a lot of this stuff because I studied history, but it just made me wonder what to do about this, and I think I'll leave it open in this regard, because, what do I know? Anyway, Polostan, have you read it yet? Let me know what you thought about it in the comments down below. Like, subscribe, share this with someone. I don't know, do the things. Join the Patreon if you feel like giving me money. I do really appreciate that, but you don't have to. Yeah, do the things. I'll see you very soon when I talk about a different book. Possibly Chaga by Ian MacDonald. Possibly about something very, very different. Who knows? And until then, thanks and cheers.